Consistency in surfing can be a challenge, where one day we're ripping and everything's going to plan, and the next we're out of position in the lineup, our waves are shutting down, we're slipping off our board, bogging rails and purling nose rides. It goes without saying that this is one of the most frustrating aspects of surfing, especially when the bad surfs outnumber the good. Today, I'm going to share with you how I improved my consistency in the water and how you can improve your surfing consistency too. This is Tip Time, now let's get into it. Alright guys, welcome back to another segment of Tip Time where we take a deep dive into your question. Thanks so much to Lucas for the question today, which was around asking about tips for working on consistency. It is one of the biggest problems, I guess, that I've been asked a few times from people, so I thought it'd be a great thing to delve into today. Let's get into it. One of the biggest points I did want to make today is usually there's a reason for this inconsistency. And if we kind of say, sometimes I surf well, sometimes I don't, it takes a lot of the power out of what we can actually do about it. So the first step is identifying what's actually happening in our surfs where we're not surfing well, that we can actually target and practice. Now, it might be multiple things. Firstly, to do with conditions. So maybe rights or backhand surfing is your nemesis. Maybe it's the steeper conditions when the waves get over a certain height. All of these things can play a massive influence in how we're surfing. And especially in the early stages, if we're still figuring out how to adjust our position on our board, how to, I guess, dictate where our board's going, then a lot of these factors can play a big part in how well we're surfing and how well we're able to negotiate the waves. To figure out firstly exactly what it is about the conditions that you're finding tricky and is stopping you from surfing well, I just like to think about what are your ideal conditions. So for me, I'm a goofy footer. I'll love anything 2 to 3 foot, left-handers, consistent and I guess predictable breaking waves. That's what I'd love to surf, and that's when I can take my nice nose rider out, get some really good nose time, get some nice drawn out carves and everything like that. So that's my ideal conditions. If we're to reverse that, that's when we can find the conditions that are likely to give us a bit of trouble. So say your bigger waves, for me, my backhand is obviously less comfortable than my forehand. Waves that are kind of shutting down and hard to find the right sections to, I guess, nose ride and everything like that. They're all gonna be factors that cause my surfs to be a lot more difficult. So again, just reiterating that fact that it's unlikely that it's just going to be that one day you surf poorly, the next you surf well. It's going to be something to do with the conditions. So let's delve into what we can do about that. So once you've had a bit of a think and figured out exactly what the conditions are doing to, I guess, make you surf not quite as well, we can then think about, all right, what maneuvers are more difficult in these conditions, and then even think about what can we do in these conditions fairly reliably and fairly comfortably. Now this will be a bit trickier. Obviously, if it's something like cross-stepping, then you might actually be okay turning in these conditions or just going down the line. If it's something like your takeoff in steeper conditions, this is where it gets trickier, and there's a little bit more of a process to going out and being able to surf well or enjoy those waves, because our ability to access the wave is limited to some extent as well. So it can vary depending on the maneuvers that we're looking for, but it's definitely good to identify the maneuvers that we're finding tricky in these particular conditions. Now, an example of the maneuvers that are tricky in certain conditions, and something that pertains to Lucas's question, but also I feel like it's a very relatable thing for everybody, is cross-stepping. So finding cross-stepping and even nose riding tricky in certain conditions. Now, this is a really common one because it is true that cross-stepping lends itself really well to I guess cruisier, more predictable waves, and when the waves are bigger, shutting down, really steep and critical, it inevitably gets harder. So from here, you want to be identifying in those conditions what is it that actually makes it quite tricky to do the cross-stepping, for example. So is it the steep waves? Is it the waves are shutting down? It's maybe that the waves are just breaking a little bit faster and you have to react more quickly, or maybe take 2 steps to the nose, not 4. Once we've had this analysis, we can actually do something about it. So now I want to step into how we actually surf better, more consistently, and also enjoy ourselves more often in the water as well. So the first thing that I would say is if the conditions are tricky, it might not be the best day to push the boundaries, and so we might just want to surf to our strengths. This might mean that if you're really comfortable surfing from the tail, doing turning maneuvers and things like that, on the conditions where it's bigger and the waves are a little bit faster and closing out, it might be we're not trying to push the boundaries with our nose rides and things like that, but just surfing a little bit more consistently, trying to make our waves, try to get some nice turns in. And I think in that sort of way, we can still have some success in the session, make our waves, which will probably make us enjoy the session a little bit more as well. If we've been able to identify exactly what we're having trouble with in those conditions as well, we're also thinking about, do we have the right boards for the conditions? It might be that your typical 9/6 heavily glassed single fin might not work in all types of conditions, above 4 foot and it's closing out. It could be quite tricky for those conditions. So we might want to think about adjusting our equipment, whether that's jumping on the shorty, a fish, a lighter longboard, something with maybe a little bit of edge on the rail. That can all, help to be a little bit more conducive for the waves that we've got at hand, so that we can surf the conditions a little bit better, and not feel stuck to one type of equipment in all sorts of waves, because we know that it's good to have a quiver so we can kind of attack all of these different waves. The other thing I'd start to think about is we need to change something about our surfing in these conditions. If we go out with the exact same approach when the waves are good versus when the waves are tricky, and therefore when we're having our good surfs versus when we're having our bad surfs, then we're going to get the same result. But if we change something, the first thing I think you should change is being a little bit more selective, and a little bit more patient in the water. So by selective, I mean maybe if we're taking the cross stepping, for example, when the waves are, as I was saying before, my suitable conditions, 2 foot, nice predictable lefts breaking all the way down the beach, then we don't need to be very selective about where we're doing our cross stepping, because most of the sections in those predictable conditions are going to be conducive for the cross step. If we transfer that into the conditions that are a little bit more tricky, if we're not really thinking about where we're doing our cross stepping, we're likely to get caught in a section that's really steep and fast, or that's closing out, or that is, bottoming out and becoming quite steep. And therefore the cross stepping is not going to work. We're going to be falling and wondering why we're not having the best surf. If we can make sure that we're being a bit more selective about the positions, especially our positions on the wave that we're doing these maneuvers, then I think that will go a long way. Now, this also might require us to become a little bit more selective with our maneuvers as well, because if we're really taking our time to consider what is the best spot for this, we might need to analyze and observe the wave a little bit more. So slowing things down, taking a bit more of a backseat approach, and just kind of watching the wave to see what opens up and see what it can deliver, so that you can enter that section correctly and in the right spot when the correct part of the wave presents itself for the cross step or any of the other maneuvers that we might be speaking about. So if you've got a day that's presented itself and the waves aren't ideal, what we can do is, as we've said, surf a bit more safely, surf to our strengths, and making sure that we're taking our time and being patient with those waves so that we can make the most of them when the sections do present themselves. Now, when the conditions aren't so bad, what can we do to prepare ourselves for when we've got our, less than ideal conditions, so that we can progressively over time get better and better and better to improve our consistency overall as well. What I really like to do here is think about exactly what's difficult about those conditions. So again, maybe it's the steep waves and how we have to approach the nose a little bit more quickly. And this is where in the ideal conditions, or when you've got a bit more time and you're surfing the waves you're more comfortable with, actually practicing that in those conditions. So again, I like to think you don't want to push the boundaries too much when the waves are out of your comfort zone, but when the waves are in your comfort zone, that's where we can really try and push the boundary and try these new things. So maybe, like we spoke about on a video a couple of weeks back, we can practice our 2-step approach to the nose rather than our 4 steps, which will in the end allow us to get to the nose a bit more quickly. So when the waves are a little bit steeper and they're kind of rushing off down the line, we can make the most of quickly getting to the nose ride, quickly getting back. And so we have more success in nose riding in those conditions. So that eventually over time, instead of just surfing safely or surfing to your strengths when the waves aren't, as suited to you, we can then integrate those more difficult high-level maneuvers in those conditions as well, which again will improve our surfing across all conditions and get us surfing more consistently as well. Of course, this can pertain to other things like your turning. So maybe you're really good at your calves and your down calves for longboarding, and you're not so good at your pivot turns, which is again covered in another video recently. But the pivot turns maybe could be something that you're practicing in your ideal conditions, so that when you're faced with some pretty tight little sections in some steeper waves, you can have that approach to the wave instead of having to try and do your calves, which are likely, as we know, to increase your chances of catching a rail or bogging a rail in the steeper conditions. We can go to our pivot turn so we can execute a fast, quick turn and have more success at, making our waves and just giving us some variety of maneuvers in those conditions as well. So I guess to wrap things up here, I just encourage people to think about exactly why they feel like they're inconsistent with their surfing, having a good think about the conditions that they're not having good surfs in, so that it's something that we can actually target with our practice. If we're kind of thinking, oh, I'm just an inconsistent surfer and sometimes I surf good, sometimes I don't, which might be the case sometimes, but more often than not, I think you'd find that there's something due to the conditions that is not allowing us to surf as well. And in that way, we can actually objectify it and target it through our practice. Again, by making sure when the waves are pretty tricky, we're surfing within our strengths and within our means. And then when the waves are good, practicing these things and using these difficulties as a focus for our practice. So we know if we're not as good at something, obviously we can target that and try and get better at it as well. We'll wrap that one up there. Hope everyone got a little bit out of that. If you have any more questions, we do these tip times each week. Make sure you leave any questions in the comments below and we can target those next week. Other than that, we've also got the Sunday glide coming up this Sunday. Thanks for the feedback on the last one. Was pretty happy with that and I'm glad you all got a little bit out of it too. But other than that, hope you're all getting waves and we'll catch you on the next one. Yo.